Judge Merrick is going to introduce our speaker tonight, and here is Ed.
Our speaker tonight is Professor Eric Cunningham. He's a specialist in modern Japanese history and teaches classes in Asian and world history at Gonzaga University. And the topic is he's going to discuss the colorful life and bold adventures of Ranald MacDonald. And no, that's not a typo. It really is Ranald, not Ronald. Who was the son of a Scottish fur trader and a Chinook woman, was raised at Fort Astoria. And later, after becoming marooned in Japan, he taught English and planted the seeds for North American and Japanese cultural exchange 5 years before Commodore Perry's opening of Japan. So, with that, I'll wind it up and turn it over.
Yeah, this is on. Okay. So, yeah, it's good to be back with this group. I was here in May, I think, giving a talk on the Panhandle boom from the 1880s forward. This topic is extremely interesting, and I should watch my time carefully. That talk is accurate. There's every element of the life of Ranald MacDonald, and I've heard the name pronounced Ranald and Ronald, so I'm not really sure which is right. But it's not the hamburger guy at all. It's a completely different, much more interesting person. And he, every element of this story should be its own movie. It's so completely interesting. And I first heard about it when I was a grad student at the University of Oregon in the mid-1990s. And it turned out that one of my professors, Dr. Steve Cole, was working on an MA in Japanese literature. And Steve Cole, a great scholar, was one of the founders of something called the Ranald MacDonald Friendship Society or something. So he, early on, he had found out about this story, probably around 1969. Maybe all of these things were hitting the beach at the same time. And so he presented a whole lecture on this, and I couldn't believe what had happened during the course of this guy's life. So it'll become clear. So my name is Eric Cunningham, and I teach history at Gonzaga University, and this is much more in line with my own area of research, which is modern Japanese history. And so here's the only two photos we seem to have of MacDonald is this photo taken in the 1890s on the left in his middle to old age, probably old age. And then the one on the right, which is a daguerreotype from 1853 or so, it says. Daguerreotypes are usually pretty self-evident because they have like a silver plate behind them, the way they made these wet plate photography. So I'm not sure if that is a daguerreotype, or maybe a photo of a daguerreotype. But of all the places he went, all the people he knew, we've only really got two photos of this interesting person. So he lived 1824 to 1894. And let me mention a little bit about what we know about him. That pamphlet over there may be one of the few primary sources that we have about MacDonald at all. As interesting as his life was, there's just not much out there. So most of what I'm going to talk about tonight comes out of this book, which is written by Fred Schott. And Fred's up in that, he's the guy with the blue tie in that picture, who's a friend of mine, and also one of the truly great Japan scholars alive today. And he's not an academic historian, which is why his books are actually really good. And interesting and fun to read. And he's an amazing author. I invited him out here to do a talk at Gonzaga, I think it was 2012 or something, on every time he writes a book, it kind of redefines an entire terrain. And he was I think he was really the first person to bring the various stories of MacDonald into some kind of coherency. And this is the book, I want to plug it, The Native American in the Land of the Shogun, Ranald MacDonald and the Opening of Japan. And it's an amazing book about an amazing story. And I came to know Fred by way of my professor, Dr. Cole, who was one of his very best friends. And so it's just really, really nice to not only to know these people, but to sort of be in on something of the ground level of the way the story has been written and produced over the years. There really should be several movies about this whole thing. The original book was MacDonald's own narrative, which I'll talk about near the end of this slideshow. Ranald MacDonald, excuse me, the narrative of his life, 1824 to 1894, which was published long after he was gone. I don't think he wrote, I'm going to die this year, so I'll make the title of this book 1894. So but this was finally published after a lot of turmoil in the 20s. And then Fred's own book, this one here, The Native American in the Land of the Shogun. And then a really interesting book, Ranald MacDonald, Pacific Rim Adventurer by Joanne Rowe of 1997. And as Dick was indicating earlier, every historian who writes about anything has their own slant, their own bias, their own investment on what matters most about the story. And because the story is so diverse and interesting, you get a lot of different perspectives on it. And for what it's worth, Fred's own take on this is really to discuss what happened to MacDonald when he was in Japan. But even that was a tiny slice of his whole interesting life. This book here, this is probably the last time, one or two other things to say about what we know about MacDonald. So, this was a book written by Ava Emery Dye. I should have put her name up on here. You can see it on the book. But Ava Emery Dye wrote MacDonald of Oregon, A Tale of Two Shores. And it was in this, anybody who thought they knew anything about Ranald MacDonald took it from this book, which is a very colorful, exciting story. And you didn't really need to, you don't have to make up anything about his story to make it exciting, but she kind of did. So what she did, I'll just sort of preface, she was the one who created the story that goes like this. That when MacDonald was a young boy, living in Fort Vancouver with his father, who was a factor of the Hudson Bay Company, that 3 Japanese castaways were washed up on the shore of the Oregon Territory, which at that time was sort of a dispute between the Americans and the British. And these 3 castaways were taken to Fort Vancouver, incarcerated, interrogated. And there, the young little kid, Ranald MacDonald, said, "Oh my gosh, they look just like me. Who are these people?" You know, because MacDonald was half Chinook and half Scot. His father was Scotsman and his mother was a Chinook. And so he had never seen people that looked more like his. He never saw his mother. She died when he was still an infant. So he'd never seen people like this and wondered if they might have been like him. All of this was made up by Emery Dye. It's a great story, but it doesn't turn out to be particularly true. But because of that, according to her, I mean, the book is really great. it's worth reading, but according to her, this was what prompted the young MacDonald to grow up and say, I've got to find out who my people really are. It's a great story, but it's not. The real story is just as interesting. So this is some of the things that, you know, what do we want to call it? The common knowledge of MacDonald is a little bit, is not entirely true. He never met the castaways. He never saw them. They were true, and he was true. But the castaways came to Fort Vancouver a few months after he was shipped off and packed off to go to Manitoba for his education. So he never saw these guys. But anyway, let's see. The real interesting thing was what happened in 1891, when the widow of an illustrious Civil War hero and notorious Indian fighter, General George Armstrong Custer, came out west only 5 years after the Battle of Wounded Knee. And so she, Mrs. General Custer, as she called herself, Elizabeth Custer, whose own life was also very fascinating. After the massacre, after the Battle of Little Big Horn, she made it her life's mission to spend her career rehabilitating, or making sure that General Custer's reputation was strong, because long before we were critical of Custer for being a villain in the Indian Wars, there were people who seriously questioned his military competence. The Little Bighorn was some kind of a horrible misjudgment, miscalculation. I spent a lot of time looking at this, and from a military standpoint, I don't know if you can come quite to that conclusion, and for a lot of reasons, not to get into Custer too much, but she really spent the rest of her life making sure that George Custer's reputation was strong and solid. And so she was very much invested in what happened out west after the Indian Wars had come to a conclusion. So she had heard that in eastern, what we would call eastern Washington, there was a rather amazing, robust settlement of Native Americans, of Indians, and white settlers creating a remarkable civilization. She wanted to go out and see it. And they said, oh, by the way, there's a crazy old Indian out there who says he was a castaway, and he went off to see the Japanese when he was young. And so she said, no, I'm going to go out and see it. So she took the train all the way out here, and she wrote this article that appeared in Harper's Weekly in July 1891. That's the cover of the magazine this appeared in. And she wrote this story called "An Out of the Way Outing." And she talked about, in great detail, about the settlement at Fort Colville and what a remarkable civilization was being built through the mutual harmony and cooperation of the Indian tribes out west and the settlers. But she also did mention this strange old guy that she'd been directed to. And MacDonald this is where MacDonald finally retired. He spent his final days in Fort Colville and met Mrs. Custer. And by her accounts, he was the most gracious, well-spoken, articulate, courtly gentleman she'd ever met, but also crazy as a bedbug from the various stories that he was telling. And she called him the Prince of the Paupers, because MacDonald never really had more than a penny or two to his name. And he was living in this broken down shack, but still bearing himself as a true prince of the world. And while she was there, he walked her around the settlement and told her about his life. And she went back and wrote the story and said, it was the most remarkable thing I'd ever seen, but this guy was nuts. She said, she didn't even remember what he said. She goes, oh, this little old man that I met said that he went to China in his youth and had gone to China, and he was the first American in China. And she's writing, obviously, this is ridiculous. So this is what appeared in Harper's, and MacDonald read it. And he was just scandalized. He was absolutely broken that after being so nice to this crazy lady married to the, General Custer, that she would so grossly misrepresent him. And he wrote articles, the Kettle Falls weekly newspaper, which doesn't really get out to the world. And it certainly didn't in the 1890s. But he was like, good gracious, what does the guy have to do? I told her everything, and everything I told her was true, and she thought that I was a man. So this was really how the story of MacDonald gets underway. And this is a picture of the Fort Colville settlement back in the old days. So he himself, as I mentioned, he was born at Fort Astoria. If you go to Astoria now, you can see a little plaque outside where the Hudson Bay Company headquarters used to be. It's up on a little hill overlooking the water. It's all there. But his father was Archibald MacDonald, a Scotsman who was one of the major factors, one of the managers of the Hudson Bay Company. This is going way, way back. So we know for a long time that this territory was under dispute. And the English, whenever it suited him, MacDonald would say, oh yeah, I'm a British citizen. And if it suited him to say he was an American, he did that too. Because whatever he needed at any given moment, he would use. And he was never lying. Archibald MacDonald was married to a woman named Princess Raven, who was in fact the daughter of Chief Cunningham, who was a certifiable Native American hero. And so when Mrs. Custer's article came out accusing him of being this prince of the paupers, he said, well, I actually am of royal blood. So whatever you want to call me, I will accept it as a compliment. And he took that very seriously. So Cunningham was a remarkable figure, especially skilled at diplomacy and trade, and he was one of the people that really did engineer a harmonious relationship between the settlers and the Hudson Bay Company. And the Hudson Bay Company, Shaw is at great pains to point out that the Hudson Bay Company was the furthest thing in the world from a racist, genocidal company. They wanted to make money, and if they could use locals, they would. And if they actually encouraged the merchants in the company to intermarry, build families, get married to the native women, build homes, because we need this. This will be good for settlement, it will be good for the economy. So this was really the attitude of the Hudson Bay Company, very different from the attitude of the U.S. Army, after the Civil War. So he was born in Astoria, and as a very tiny baby was moved to Fort Vancouver where his father got a new job. And then the fact of the matter is he was brought to Red River Colony, which is in Manitoba, in 1834. And so he really did miss the arrival of these three Japanese castaways by 4 or 5 months. It really does make it a great story, but he wasn't really quite right. So what happened was, this was happening a lot in the early 19th century as more and more, as the American whaling industry became more aggressive. The British were relentlessly aggressive in trying to expand their mercantile footprint in the Pacific. Japan was dealing with a never-ending stream of foreign ships coming into their waters, which they didn't really like. And coincident with this was a remarkable number of castaway episodes in which Japanese fishermen and Japanese traders, whose job it was to really just ply the inland waterways or stay close to the coast of Japan, would very often get blown off course and find themselves wherever the Japanese current takes you. So one year, it was in January of 1834, the Hudson Bay Company took 3 Japanese guys into custody who'd been at sea, stranded for. So they left in January. They were taken into custody in January of 1834, and they got underway on their ship in October of 1832. That's how long they were sitting on a ship without a rudder or a mast, floating in the cold Pacific waiting to land somewhere. And what happens? You land on the beach, and a bunch of guys from the Hudson Bay Company come and put handcuffs on you, drag you, and they incarcerated them. And so these three guys, the Otokichi, Iwakichi, and Kyukichi, three peasant fishermen of no particular consequence were taken and put into custody. And this is where Ava, well, this is where the story comes from, that somehow MacDonald met these people as a kid. He never did. And then there's also a story, well, unfortunately, these three men never returned home. Well, one of them did. Otokichi, the drawing of the guy on the left, he did make it home. And he was in Japan long enough. He was in Japan when the Americans actually showed up and had a chance to meet some of the after the Perry mission, when Japan did become open to the West, he was there. And interestingly, he got out of there as quickly as he could. He died in Singapore. He wound up going to Hong Kong and then to Singapore. He didn't want to be in Japan. Because the rule was, at the time, any castaway that was picked up and repatriated would be executed upon arrival back home. Given the Japanese xenophobic reaction to any kind of overseas exchange. So here's what the brief detour. This was a part of the Tokugawa dynasty, the Tokugawa shogunate, which came into being in 1603. So after 100 years of civil war, the Tokugawa family, I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of what the shogunate was a warlord, a military clan that took over Japan, unified the country after a long period of civil war, and set it upon a path of fairly successful development for the next 250 years until Perry came in 1853. But part of the Tokugawa foreign policy, which was no foreign policy at all, was to shut their country completely off from the outside world. The only exception were the Dutch, who had a trading post in Nagasaki. And they built an artificial island in Nagasaki Bay called Dejima, which means the outer island, the island, the excluded island. And that's where the Dutch lived. And for, really from 1600 until, for 250 years, there was a small contingent of Dutch traders who lived on that island and couldn't leave it. And there they did their trading. Once a year, the Governor General of the Dutch East India Company would have to make a trek up to Edo, and there he would have to give an annual report to the shogun as to what's going on in the wider world. And the Captain Generals took it seriously. They compiled a full report to tell the shogun what was going on. But more often than not, the shoguns would say, "Okay, let's get this guy drunk and let's make him speak Dutch to us. That sounds really funny when you do gibberish, and dance for us, will you?" And this is what the Captain Generals did in order to maintain in good graces with the shogun. So it was a complete, it really was an isolation, even with the Dutch. Foreigners could not come into the country. Castaways were not allowed back. So Japan was really cut off. But in the middle of the 19th century, you've got this interesting dynamic between castaways washing up on the western shores of the U.S. and people like MacDonald, and any number of other foreigners who wanted to get in Japan and see what was going on. So in the 19th century, again, I'll make the point again, there's just more and more pressure on Japan to open, to trade, to do something with itself, as the Russians, the Americans, the British were all, parking offshore and seeing what's going on. Now, MacDonald, for his part, I guess I should continue. It was really beginning in the 1900s, the Russians began to appear, and the Russians started setting up their own settlements in the Kuril Islands. So north of Japan, the islands north of Japan, the Russians would just settle. Even though the Japanese claimed this as their territory, the Russians also claimed it. But the Phaeton incident of 1808 was probably one of the original false flag episodes. A British ship ran a Dutch flag up its mast and said, "Let's go check out Nagasaki." And they went in and they blew up the the port facilities, and they sent a couple of people ashore, and they just basically engaged in some basic plunder, got back on the ship and sailed away, making the Japanese, the local magistrate at Nagasaki was forced to commit suicide for being so ill-prepared for this onslaught. But there's nothing you can do to prepare for something like this. And it was during the Napoleonic Wars, so the Dutch were technically allied with Napoleon, and the British said, let's go mess up their thing in Japan. And that's all it was. But it was a sign to the Japanese that they couldn't really control anything. In 1825, a Japanese statesman named Isao Seishisan promulgated something called the New Theses. And the New Theses was a policy that said, shoot and don't ask any questions. If any foreign vessel of any kind whatsoever gets within range, shoot at it, end of story. We don't talk to these people, we don't want to deal with them, they're nothing but trouble. And so that was 1825. In 1837, the Morrison was attempting to drop some castaways off in Japan. We found your guys, they washed up on our shores, we're bringing them back. The Morrison was fired upon. They didn't want the castaways back, and they didn't want to see any ships. And then the American Captain Biddle, in 1845, what's interesting about this was right after the Treaty of Nanjing, in which China was opened up to the West after the Opium Wars. And Biddle basically convinced the US president, you know, if we don't act quickly on Japan, the British will take it over. We need to get in there and establish a presence. Okay, go over there. So Biddle went in and tried to get a trade agreement, and they just sent him home. So, but you need the more visionary people in Japan realized that there were a lot of people out there, you know, all they knew about the West were the Dutch, but here are all these Americans and British that they didn't even know about, and they're speaking this weird language. So whatever language you're speaking, we should learn it pretty quickly, otherwise we'll get in trouble. So if there's an interesting coincidence between a real need to learn English and good old MacDonald, who wants to get over to Japan. So MacDonald grew up. He finished his training at the Red River, Manitoba, went to work at a dry goods store, got a job at a bank. His father really wanted him to be a respectable merchant and live a good, prosperous life. But him and his father had a lot of friction between them. And so he just said, you know, he'd heard about the Japanese people that showed up at Fort Vancouver, because he was in communication with friends back in Vancouver, and they were saying to him, the most amazing thing happened. We found these three guys, and they were, you know, we don't know where they came from. And he, you know, his imagination went kind of wild. He wanted to get over to Japan. And so while he's doing these menial jobs, not particularly liking it, and he said, how can I get over there? He eventually wound up in New York. He went to Sag Harbor, and which is really close to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And so he got in touch with a lot of the captains in the whaling industry. He goes, well, if I want to get over there, I need to get aboard ship. So he signed on board a whaler called the Plymouth. And the Plymouth was getting ready to get underway for Japan. So he went to Japan with the Plymouth and was a good member of the crew. Everybody who ever met MacDonald thought he was just the greatest, most interesting, charming, affable person they'd ever met. So he spent a couple of years in Hawaii. This is actually a picture of the Lahaina coastline. It was a huge whaling depot in its day. And finally, the ship under the command of Captain Edwards got underway for Japan in 1847. And this is where it gets interesting. He made a deal with the captain that he told the captain to put him ashore after the whaling business was done, after they finished their whaling and they harvested the oil and they'd done all the actual work. Before the ship sailed back to Hawaii, he said, please put me ashore in a boat somewhere near Japan, and I'll figure out how to get there. And the captain said, you're nuts. You know, you will certainly die, because they're so far north. It was freezing cold. You know, if you really want me to do this, I will, but you're not going to make the trip. So he said, no, this is what I really need to do. I want you to do it. So they gave him a boat. They gave him a little bit of provisions. He said, not too many provisions, because I don't want anybody in Japan to think that I planned this. So off he goes, and he washes up you know, the original story, right, the story of Mrs. Dai was that he wanted to find the connection between himself and the Japanese, but he admitted later in his own autobiography, my principal motive in this whole thing must be confessed, the mere gratification of a love of adventure. That would be like hiking to the top of Mount Everest alone without any, oh yeah, this will be adventurous. Because your chances of getting killed there should have been 100%. But it didn't happen. When he landed, one of the first things that happened was what one of the samurai, when they dragged him onto the beach, Nipponjin da. This guy's Japanese. I mean, he was probably heaved a sigh of relief. Part of this was certainly, this is a statue or a bas-relief thing of MacDonald in Japan. So they actually honor him there as well as here. So he's taken into custody. This is where he landed. Look at that thing. So, and one of the first things he says in his autobiography, oh, it looks like Mount Hood, or you know, the mountain that he recognized from his childhood. Oh yeah, this would be perfect for me. This looks just like my home country. And there actually were villagers on this thing. This at the top is a little tiny remote island called Yagishiri Island, which is south of Rishiri. So the ship dropped him off and got out of there. They were gone. They said goodbye to him, you know, farewell, good luck. And then he just started rowing for about a day and a half, 2 days, 3 days. And he eventually wound up on this place called Rishiri Island. But he didn't want to go to the island. He wanted to make it look like he was in serious distress. So a couple of days before actually coming to the island, he capsized the boat himself. Like he'd stand on the gunwales of the boat and tip it over to make it look like the boat had been distressed, to damage the boat and ruin the boat and make himself look horrible. Because this will make it an unbelievable story. So then he anchored and I guess he moored the boat a couple hundred yards off the shore, and a bunch of Ainu fishermen came after him. This is so far north that the native population were all members of the Ainu ethnicity. And they found him, and they took him back to a little village on this island of Rishiri, which the Japanese had claimed, and the Russians also. So that it's already in dispute. But the Japanese are looking at this guy and figuring out, well, under the laws of our land, we should kill him on the spot and drop him in the water and we'll never hear from him again. But they said, maybe we can use this. So they brought him to a Japanese official, and the Japanese official said, well, we have to take him to the daimyo. The daimyo would be the local lord. So this little island was under the jurisdiction of the guy in the middle there, Matsumai Takahiro. And he is the lord of Matsumai domain, which was the only really legitimate Japanese domain in Hokkaido. Most of Hokkaido is complete wilderness. But on the bottom shores of Hokkaido, you had an actual outpost of the Tokugawa company. It's funny, when you look at the Matsumai Takahiro, he's basically dressed up like a native Ainu. I mean, he's wearing, kind of looks like a Japanese warlord, but he actually looks more like an indigenous Ainu. But they take him aboard, they take him to Soya was a place that the Russians had actually claimed for their own. They take him to the castle town. And then Matsumai, even though he was the lord of a very, very remote province, he was actually very close to the shoguns. So he said, I've got to do something with this guy. They sent him down to Nagasaki, and Nagasaki was the only place where foreigners lived. So now MacDonald is clapped into the bottom of a boat, and they ship him another 1,000 miles by sea down to Nagasaki. And there he gets out, and they put him into jail. And while he's in jail, he's questioned by the local magistrates, and he makes up a fake story because they're asking him, how did it come to? The Japanese had already seen several shipwrecks, and this usually involved several sailors washing ashore. So how is it that one guy in a boat suddenly winds up on the shore? So this is a little bit suspicious. So he cooked up this whole story well, the captain promised me $180 worth of whale oil, and he gypped me out of it. So I said, let's take over this ship. He made up this whole story, and the captain said, we're going to get rid of you, and we're going to cast you ashore. And that was good enough for the Japanese. They believed it. And while down there, they said, you know, what is this weird language you're speaking? And he goes, I'm an American. No, I'm a Canadian. No, I'm a British. I speak English. I'm a British subject. And they said, okay, well, English seems to be the language that a lot of the barbarians who are showing up around here use. So why don't you teach some of our guys how to speak it? So this saved him from getting killed. And there were 14 samurai that actually studied under him. The most distinguished of which is this guy in the picture, Moriyama Inosuke, who, for somehow or another, was just brilliant at languages. He learned Dutch by reading books. He actually taught himself how to speak Dutch from reading the Dutch books that came into Nagasaki every year. And so he just was all excited to meet this guy who could speak English. So they kept MacDonald alive long enough to teach these guys how to speak English. And interestingly, while teaching, these samurai were under penalty of death not to reveal anything they learned from MacDonald. So he's on the side, he's also making friendships with the guards. So in addition to the samurai, he's talking to the guards, and they're teaching him Japanese, which they're not supposed to do. And one of the guards was just so excited about MacDonald, he brought his wife and daughter to go to meet him, which was really taboo. And I think that guard wound up either getting killed or fired for just because they wanted to see MacDonald. Over the course of 7 months, MacDonald teaches English to Moriyama and these other samurai, and learns enough Japanese to, he doesn't really need to use it, but he does learn some Japanese. And while he's there, he figures out that 2 other groups of shipwrecked sailors, one from the Lawrence and another one from a whaler called the Lagoda, were also being incarcerated. But all of these other sailors were pretty much of the criminal element. So word got out to America by way of the Dutch that the sailors from the Lagoda were being beaten and tortured, which was pretty much true, because they were criminals. The sailors from the Lagoda were deserters. They'd actually left their ship and taken a boat to try to make their way to Japan. So unlike MacDonald, who was trying to get to Japan, these people wound up there accidentally. So when word got out to the United States that there were Americans, wonderful, wonderful American mutineer deserters were being punished by the Japanese, the outrage was through the roof. So they sent Captain Glenn from Hong Kong to go get these guys. So while Glenn went to Nagasaki to pick up these other castaways, Glenn found out, to his surprise, there was another American guy. So that's how MacDonald got home. So MacDonald winds up going home. Well, he thought he was going home, but Captain Glenn just dropped him off in Hong Kong. And then the ship went back to the U.S., and MacDonald spent the next 4 or 5 years traveling the world some more, signing himself off as sailors on other whaling ships, and just kept continuing to live his life of adventure. So when he finally got home, what Schott says in this book, which is really interesting, is that if MacDonald had gone straight home and written up his memoirs, he would have been a superhero. But he didn't. He didn't think that anything that had happened to him was all that interesting. He just kept, going and doing his thing. So by the time he really did get home, the story was more or less out, and it had been trumped by much larger events. Captain Glenn went straight to Congress and said, yeah, there's this weird guy from the Hudson Bay Company who was telling us all about the Japanese and how they're not barbarians, they're really wonderful people, and the time is right for us to go in and make a trade agreement with them. And MacDonald himself wrote a letter to the U.S. Congress and said, the Japanese are good people, and we should open up some kind of a trade agreement with them. So within a few years, as we all know, Commodore Perry shows up in 1853, within 6 months has a trade agreement, and now the whole world is infatuated with the story of Perry and the Americans. in Japan, and MacDonald is not even a footnote, because nobody knows who MacDonald even is. But MacDonald is the guy, when Perry came ashore in 1853, he met Einosuke Moriyama, the prized people of MacDonald. And the first thing Moriyama said was, how is MacDonald doing? He thought MacDonald was somebody important. He asked Commodore Perry, how's Mr. MacDonald doing? So who are you talking about? Who's MacDonald? We don't know how he's doing, but I don't know how he's doing. But Einosuke was able to help the Americans concoct a trade deal with the Japanese. So this is why MacDonald has this reputation of being the first professor or the first teacher of English to the Japanese in history. So to bring it to a close here, MacDonald spent a long time. He achieved fame in other areas. He was a gold prospector and an explorer and adventurer, and he went on whaling ships. And finally he went home and said, maybe I should tell my story to the world. And he met this guy, Malcolm McLeod, who was a writer, kind of an imaginative writer who wanted to write this story about Japan, and he was making up all kinds of crazy stuff. So even though McLeod's story was completely crazy, MacDonald thought, well, at least McLeod can help me get published. So MacDonald fed McLeod the story of his adventures, and the way it came out was it just sounded like all the rest of the crazy stuff that McLeod was making up. So nobody ever really realized that everything that happened to Ronald MacDonald was actually true. And then Elizabeth Custer comes out, and MacDonald thinks, finally I can set the record straight. And it doesn't because she just thinks he's a crazy old Indian. And he dies 3 years later. The book, his own memoirs, again, don't come out until 1923. He dies in 1894, and his niece is with him as he passes away. And his last words were, "Sayonara, my dear, sayonara." What word is that? What country? Nobody even believed that he'd gone to Japan. It's just amazing. But he did. And so now, it's kind of interesting. It's only like 70 miles from here. If you go up and see MacDonald's gravesite, if you have seen it, this is the smallest state park in Washington. And it's in the most forlorn spot, off by the side of the road, just kind of sitting there. What city is it near? Yeah, Perry County. It's just there. Yeah. And for him, that was his country, but it's for someone who lived a life that was larger than life. His official record in memory of history is like a footnote of a footnote, which is just amazing. But it's a nice little. Whoever wrote this knew who he was. Ronald MacDonald, son of Princess Raven and Archibald MacDonald. His was a life of adventure, sailing the seven seas, wandering in far countries, but returning at last to rest in his homeland. Here. It was so fascinating. Sayonara, farewell. And beginning in this, so this article came out in '69. In the '70s, people began to wake up to this, and they started the MacDonald Friendship Society. And I guess he got the last laugh on everybody because he's, his reputation is large and growing. So it's just an amazing story. And again, I'll put in another plug. The way his story impinges upon the history of the trading communities, the Hudson Bay in the Northwest, and also the whaling industry, and also Japan, and the settlements of the Northwest after the Indian Wars. He was sort of on the periphery of huge changes in the historical development of the world, but was never more than just a guy. But everybody who knew him would have characterized him as the single most fascinating character they ever met. Very, very interesting. Anyway, so I don't know how to answer questions about this, but I'll do my best. This is the last slide. So thank you very much for your. honest money and anthropology would say that the Native American tribes had some sort of connection. That had some connection with transmigration of people from North. Japan was settled by 3 vectors of population. One from Central Asia, one from North Asia, and one from Polynesia. So it's highly likely that the Northern Asian people stopped in Japan on the way to North America. But having said that, I would be hastened to add that a lot of the academic anthropology that says America is no older, the human settlements here are no older than 30,000 years, are proving to be wrong all the time. They're very, very old societies in North America. But so the answer is yes, and yes, but we don't know quite how.
My other one was, the Dutch had established a trading post on the island in Japan.
Yeah.
What were they trading with the Japanese? What goods?
Well, once a year they would send a ship to Nagasaki, and all of the goods that Japan had, silk and tea, food products, so they were getting goods from Europe coming into Japan. But the Japanese didn't really want a whole lot of Western goods. It wasn't a great concern of theirs. So the Dutch wanted to trade Japanese goods. Some food products, but mostly textiles, cotton textiles, silk, and things of this nature. The Japanese, one of the reasons they set up the isolation policy is because they were starting to bleed precious metals. All the gold and silver in Japan was running away. So they weren't necessarily wanting to buy anything from Europe. They were willing to give them silk in exchange for European goods, which they weren't interested in. So what really came in was technology and ideas. So, and the samurai who lived in Nagasaki were very judicious about writing down everything they learned from the Dutch, but also keeping it close to their chest, because if too much knowledge got out, it would destabilize Japan's own sense of isolation. So it was an interesting arrangement.
Do you think Japanese school children, like today, read about him, about the opening of Japan up? Is part of that story here?
No, this is the province of history geeks. Even in Japan, and there's a lot of Japanese people who belong to the MacDonald Friendship Society, and they're very serious. They take boat trips out to Rishi Island and Rishi Island. They really love this whole story. But no, it's not part of the narrative of what Japanese people learn about the Western encounter at all. Yeah.
I grew up in Republic, so I've been to the Grayson, but I get the newspaper, which is the View now.
Where's it published exactly?
The View is published in
Republic. Okay.
And there are articles all the time about people who come from Japan with a group of children
To see it.
And they're treated like royalty. And the Madeline Perry, who's the head of the Historical Society up there, she's spoken here before, but it's fun to follow that.
It's very fun to follow. And when you meet the people who are really engaged, they're the best historians I know, more than the people in my profession. I mean, they really love. It's a wonderful thing to see people really focusing on the human element and how this really brings people together. It's very, very, very interesting. Yeah.
Can I ask, how did you get interested?
Just sitting in an introduction in a Japanese literature course, and my professor, Steve Cole, who was one of Fred Schott's best friends, just gave this. I'm going to share some stuff with you guys that you might find interesting. And I was very hooked, and then I got to meet Fred, and the hook just got deeper, and it's a wonderful story. And I don't know anybody but here that wouldn't be really interested and enthralled by all this. Yeah, the courage, the imagination, the surviving an ordeal like that.
Can I write a screenplay?
Well, there should. I think they did make a movie kind of about it, but it wasn't any good. But to really do research like this, and this, I think you could do something amazing with that. Maybe Marvel will pick up on it. If you really want a screenplay published, you have to make it about superheroes. Oh, anything else? Well, thank you for your kind attention.
Well, thank you. Wow, what a presentation. I knew it was a fascinating story, but there was so much more there I'd never heard before. Wow, what a story. Oh, and right here from the Northwest, can you believe that? It's one of your almost ancestors here. One thing that's interesting for me on that last one, the monument, how Colville is spelled. It had 2 double L's. And the monument at St. Paul's has 2 L's. But the Hudson Bay Company, Fort Colville, is spelled with 1 L. C-O-L-V-I-L-E, there's no double L. And I know I went to the historian National Park Service at Lake Roosevelt and asked her about that monument because the wording is misspelled. And she said, well, that monument is over 50 years old. And as that monument is that age, we're not going to change it. But she acknowledged that it was spelled incorrectly. The Hudson Bay Fort is C-O-L-V-I-L-E from a director of the Hudson Bay Company. Fort Colville, U.S. Army, C-O-L-V-I-L-L-E, is spelled differently on purpose. And here's another interesting history lesson. Names that are the same, but in different countries, are intentionally spelled different to show they are across the border. Eureka, Colville, which one? Nisqually. Intentionally, Kootenai, intentionally spelled differently as they cross the border. Kootenai Casino in Bonners Ferry, they use a Y instead of an I. You go across the border, it's now an I, the N. So the Colville here is intentionally spelled differently, but that monument spells it for Army Fort Colville, not Hudson Bay Fort Colville. Very fascinating. And you agree with that? Yeah, so. Okay, well, we'd like to recognize our speakers, so Aaron, come on up, back up. By the way, Aaron just joined our club, so he's now a member. We are happy to have you as a member as well. I brought these out for non-members. We give a couple of Pacific Northwesterners, and I had a couple of extras that I thought you might be interested in. One of them is called Days of Freedom, the Coeur d'Alene boyhood, the Coeur d'Alene Indian, and he's talking about his boyhood. This is from April 2002. And the other one I brought out was Baxter General Hospital. And do you know the history of Baxter? Somebody does. Where your Veterans Hospital is today, that was a Navy hospital during World War II. And those little buildings, all those little houses around Veterans Hospital, those were government housing for the military that was stationed there at Baxter Hospital. Oh, there you go. So, Aaron, thank you very, very much. That was really a wonderful presentation. Yes. Okay, next month, we've got